In this video, we're going to talk about our axial skeleton, which forms the longitudinal axis of our body. And our learning objectives are to identify and label the bones in the axial skeleton and relate bone structure to function, to compare a fetal skull with an adult skull, to describe problems with our vertebral column, to label some bony landmarks on a typical vertebrae, and to compare different segments of that vertebral column. So what's shown here in blue is that axial skeleton. You'll see that it's got a few major parts. It's got our skull, our thoracic cage, and our vertebral column. And it ends with that ending part of our vertebral column. Let's start with our skull. So your skull is made of the cranium and your facial bones, and they're joined together by sutures as they're joined, except for your mandible, which is your jawbone. Your cranium has 8 bones, 2 of which are paired, and your facial bones are made of 14 bones, all of which are paired except for 2 of them, your mandible and your vomer. Now, this might be a little overwhelming, but let's break it down here. Your cranial bones are shown in blue. You have your frontal bone, your parietal bone, the temporal bone over your temples, the occipital bone in the back, and then towards the front, you have the ethmoid and sesamoid bone, which is not shown here because it's kind of on the underside. Shown in red are some of the facial bones, again, making up the face. What's shown in black, we have some sutures. Again, these are how some of these bones are joining together, as well as some key bony landmarks. Now, I want you to know some of this information. I want you to know your bones, the cranium and facial bones, and I want you to know some of the key landmarks, like the mastoid process and the zygomatic process, shown here. But you don't have to know every single bony landmark in the skull. If we take the top off and we look down superior view, this is where we can start to see better that ethmoid bone in orange and the sesamoid bone in pink. We have a temporal, parietal, occipital, again, blue showing our cranial bones. And the ones I want you to know here, don't worry about the other bony landmarks from this angle. Okay, now we're looking at the inferior view with the mandible removed. You can see some more of those facial bones shown in red, and again, the cranial bones in blue. And this is the most common view. This is the anterior view from straight on. We've got a frontal bone, parietal bone, you can see sesamoid and ethmoid. But what really comes into view are our facial bones, specifically our mandible here, which is the strongest bone and the only movable bone in your skull. Now, we'll work on in class some exercises labeling the bones and coming up with mnemonics to help us remember our cranial and our facial bones. In our skull, we have our paranasal sinuses, and they're named for the bones that they're near. So we have a frontal sinus, an ethmoid sinus, a sesamoid sinus, and a maxillary sinus. And these are air-filled sacs that help us amplify sounds, but they can easily be filled with mucus from our nose and throat. And if that happens, that's when we can develop a sinus infection. The only part of our skeletal system that does not articulate with another bone is our hyoid bone. It's in our neck. It's anchored by ligaments, and it serves as a movable base for our tongue. Now, fetal skulls are different from adult skulls because they still have fibrous areas. They still have soft spots on the top of the head specifically, and these are called fontanelles. And what this allows for is for the skull to compress during birth. Now, you've all seen those little babies who come out kind of with those cone heads, and they need the little helmet to wear when they're first growing up. And that's again because the bones in their skull are not fully formed. They're still soft, they're still movable, and they don't convert to bone fully until around 22 to 24 months. Fetal skulls are also large compared to their body size. For newborns, a skull is 1/4 of their size, whereas for adults, ours is only 1/8. Now let's talk about our vertebral column. Your vertebral column has 26 bones broken down into 5 areas. At the top, we've got our cervical curvature made of 7 vertebrae, then our thoracic made of 12, lumbar made of 5, and then at the bottom we have fusion of 5 bones in our sacrum and 4 bones in our coccyx. And you can see that the spine has a nice curve to it. It's flexible, and its major function is to protect our spinal cord and support our posture. In between the bones are intervertebral discs made of fibrocartilage that are squishy. Now, if that disc bulges out, this is when we get a herniated disc. And as we get older, we increase our risk for a herniated disc. That's because young people have more water in those discs, which means it's more compressionable. And as we get older, they start to dry out, more likely to bulge. Our spine has natural curvatures that develop with age. So the first one is our primary curvature, and this is present at birth. And you can see, looking at a cute little newborn here, that their spine has a C shape to it. And that's because right now it's controlled by the thoracic and the sacral region. This is why little babies can't lift their head up. They don't have a cervical curvature yet. They don't have strength in their neck. Instead, they're dominated just by thoracic and the sacral region. However, as we start to get older and build strength, that's when we get these other curvatures. We'll develop cervical curvature and be able to raise our head and hold our head up. And then eventually we'll develop a lumbar curvature when we're able to walk. And that lumbar curvature is what centers our body weight on our lower limbs. Now, there are three different homeostatic imbalances that can occur. Abnormal curvatures of the spine. We have scoliosis, which is a lateral deviation and a sideways deviation. Kyphosis, which is a hunching of the cervical spine. And in pregnancy, you get lordosis, which is a hunching, extra curve in the lumbar spine to counterbalance that weight that develops. This is a typical vertebrae. A few things I want you to be aware of. The body is the part of the vertebrae that bears the weight. There is a hole, a vertebral foramen, and this is where the spinal cord passes through. And then you can see these processes on the posterior end that connect to muscles and ligaments. If we focus on the cervical vertebrae, C1, the first one, is called the atlas, and C2, the second one, is called the axis. And these have no body, but they have depressions for, the first one has for the occipital condyles to fit your skull. And the pivot for the atlas is with the axis, and this allows us to nod our head yes. The area between C1 and C2 allows us to shake our head no. Now, typically, cervical vertebrae are nice and light. They've got short spinous processes, and they have transverse processes with gaps for our vertebral arteries. If we move down to our thoracic region, you'll see that they have larger bodies. They have processes to articulate with ribs. That body is a heart shape, and they also have those costal facets for articulating with ribs. The lumbar vertebrae are the biggest. Now, if we move all the way down to the bottom, we see the sacrum is a fusion of 5 vertebrae. The alae here connect laterally with our hips, and they form a sacroiliac joint with our hips. And these are the back wall of our pelvis. The sacral canal, it holds the last bit of our vertebral canal. The coccyx is our tailbone, and these are the fusion of 3 to 5 very tiny bones. Moving on, we have our thoracic cage, which is made of our sternum and our ribs. The sternum is a flat bone. It's a fusion of 3 bones, the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. And this is attached directly to the first 7 ribs. It has a few landmarks. The sternum provides a few landmarks like the jugular notch and the sternal angle that helps direct people to the anatomy of the heart lying behind it. Our ribs come in 12 pairs. They articulate directly, and we have the first 7, which are our true ribs. These attach to the sternum via costal cartilage directly. The false ribs attach indirectly, and the floating ribs, those are not attached at all. And in between is our intercostal space, and it's filled with our intercostal muscles that help us move our rib cage up and down. In the next video, we will talk about our appendicular skeleton, which forms our limbs and our girdles.